history office in terms of our ability to capture the history, as Jim talked about, in terms of doing oral history interviews. At NASA, we make history every day. Every one of you who works here is working on something historic, something unique. We're not going to have the ability to capture all of that history or to interview everyone, but if you don't have anyone in place, you're missing out on all of that history. There's so much that will be missed, so much that will be overlooked. We were talking at lunch today, talking about, where will the documents come from? Increasingly, history has become an issue of social media. Putting something out on Twitter, putting something on Instagram or Facebook. Will that be around in 100 years? I highly doubt it. An oral history transcript could be around, a tape recording, although we don't use tapes anymore, but a digital recording. Those will be around, documents will be around, but we don't really have the type of documentation that we used to have in the past. Of course, we'll have access to documents on NTRS and things of that nature, but I mean, you need to think about the value of history, and I think that's really important.
So I left Langley to go to MIT, and if they have a lot of similarities in that they're obsessed with the future. And I was told frequently at MIT doesn't care about history, we hate history. And I learned that that's a lie. They love history. Now, it helps to rebrand it and sometimes call it stories, but here's the thing, that the four of us on this stage, when we all went to graduate school and got our training, we became obsessed with the issues of causality. Why? Why did this happen? How? When? And we're taught to be objective and so somewhat agnostic. It's hard to know who was the first. What do we care about that? But the fact is that it was here at Langley, and I had the great privilege of teaching courses over at Old Dominion University at the same time, that I realized that the historical agenda of places like Langley, or MIT for that matter, is the problem of originality. You don't get a law named after you, you don't get a patent, you don't get, you don't win a Nobel Prize if you can't prove that yours is an original thought. And so I really feel that the agenda of history is less about hoarding. Our job is not simply to hoard Langley's crown jewels and save them away. And I say this, I preserve stuff every day, so don't get me wrong. And I love it, I love old stuff, right? But presentation is the other side of that coin. We have to make history usable and accessible, and that means that we have to think about the information delivery systems that make these objects and papers and documents, and there are people in this room already starting to do that, putting things online, so taking the cassette recordings and digitizing them and making them available online. I think those are crucial to this, because we are at this moment in time, and this is not unique to our times. The NAC, I mentioned Hoover wanting to cancel the NACA in the past. Well, there have been existential crises for Langley and this agency many times. I arrived in '94 when the Cold War had ended. There was staff cuts and reorganization. It was a crazy time, right? People were really uncertain. Newt Gingrich and the contract with America had come in, and atmospheric sciences was evil at that time. Sound familiar, right? But the point is that you have to have confidence in your core values. And I think that's one of the gifts of history and of the relationships that Jim and I were both lucky enough to be able to cultivate, is a sustained relationship with the research community such that we could not only take care of, conserve the stuff, but that we understood the core values and developed competency in communicating those values to a larger community. And that, I think, is one of the great gifts that a historical organization, whether, I kind of like Jim's idea, you get a young person in, probably someone who may not know that much about space that much, and let them learn.
Jim, did you have any further thoughts?
Well, I guess one thing that I was going to talk about that I think is an important point, it's not on the issue of why there's a good reason to have a historian here ongoing, but there's a lot of things that you can find out in oral history that you can't find out any other way. Axel Matson, this connects to Jennifer's talk. Axel Matson came here he was an NC State engineering graduate, and he came here during the Second World War. And after Mother Langley lost all of her children, they also lost budget and lost focus. And Floyd Thompson was a center director in the early '60s when this transition was happening. And Floyd wanted to know what's going on down at this manned spacecraft center. Is there a way we can tap into some of that big space money budget? And secondly, how do we find out what Langley can do for? How do we find out what's going on so we can help? Well, Thompson sent Matson down, and this was a story that could only be told. I mean, Matson didn't even know if he wanted to tell me the story or even whether I should publish it. He was sent down as an undercover agent to Houston. And Axel, it's hard to describe him. Big Swedish guy, and he wouldn't necessarily strike you, and Pete, I hope you can agree or not agree, he wouldn't strike you as the most intellectual of the engineers at Langley. But he was a pretty darn smart guy, and he was sociable. He was sociable in about every possible way you can be sociable. And so he went down to Houston, and it's not even clear. I mean, Thompson must have told Gilruth that he was going down there, but nobody else knew why Matson was down there. In fact, Matson told me stories that he'd be in the elevator, and Faget would show up and he'd say, "What the hell are you doing here, Matson?" Nobody knew. Well, Matson was going in, sitting in the back of the room, listening into meetings to find out. Well, basically, how can Langley help? How can we tap into this, not just for budget, but how can we contribute? And there's a story that I tell in Spaceflight Revolution that involves the impact dynamics of the command module. That Langley got early wind of a problem that the contractor was having with the command module, and Langley started to do tests. Because Matson would, he'd be in Houston most of the time. But he would send reports back, or he'd come back, fly back and forth, and he'd go right to Thompson, and he'd tell Thompson, what's going on. And that's a story from oral history, and I think it was a really illustrative and important story, for center relationships and for what's happening now that Langley's not the center of the universe anymore. How do you stay in touch? How do you learn? How can you take advantage of the situation? And that came only from oral history. There's no documentation. I mean, this was kept completely off the record. So it's another reason why oral history is important. But it's also, and this is a little self-serving, but Axel would have never told me that story unless I developed a long-term relationship with him. I mean, I've done any number of interviews with him since then. He didn't even know for sure whether he wanted to tell me that story when he did tell me the story. But if you develop a relationship as a historian with these individuals, you end up getting these great, important stories that you just aren't going to find out about any other way. And you can't get that by having a historian that's just going to drop in and out occasionally or just sit in the library. They've got to immerse themselves in the community that they're writing about.
If I can just piggyback on that, when we interview people at Johnson, and we've interviewed folks at Langley, we've done a number of oral history projects on the NACA here. A lot of people will tell us, boy, I never told anybody this story before. But really the important thing also about doing oral history is you can get a sense of why certain decisions were made and how they were made, especially now that we're relying more and more on email. We might only see the final product that comes out. We won't get to see how an idea evolved and why it evolved that way. So I think oral history is very important for capturing those lessons and why a policy decision was made.
So some of you may not be on your smartphones, and if that's the case, there's a microphone over here if you'd like to ask a question. Let me just say in partial response to the question I posed to them that, I think Jim would have been exactly the sort of person who could sort of grasp with the complexities of Langley history. I mean, it goes all over the place. Aeronautics runs through it, but you think of all the different ways that that history is ramified, and that's largely because people with certain sets of skills and expertise saw a new challenge, reinvented their careers, created a new type of facility or expertise, and then suddenly everybody thought that was obvious and it became a big deal to them. It's that sort of intellectual thread that's very difficult to get from the documents. You need to have somebody to come in and tell you that. And I just want to make the point that, it's important for historians and future generations and your kids to get your stories by you telling them. But it's also important to the storyteller. There's something very empowering about somebody being able to identify the significance of what it is that they're working on. It's one thing to explain that to your boss or to your kids, or to understand how that connects with the budget item. But for everybody to have the opportunity to have someone listening to their stories and identifying for themselves what the significance is very compelling and inspirational. So now when all of you start to think about the stories you're going to be telling, perhaps you'll do it in the context of our next question, which basically brings the story from Apollo up to the present. So that goes for Langley's first 50 years. Its work in American history was shaped by war and by the space race. That's largely what we heard Joe talk about earlier. For the past 50 years, however, since the end of the Vietnam War, Langley's history has not had that basic geopolitical structure. How do we break the more recent decades into understandable chunks of time? Debbie, I'm going to ask you first.
Well, there's several ways you could approach that challenge. And one of the first things you do as a historian is say, what are all the possible ways you could tell a story? It's a little bit like a game of solitaire, and you lay your cards out and then you start flipping them over and trying to sense and make patterns. So I'm going to make a little bit of a stab here and also talk about a subject of preservation that has not been raised to this point. And that is, in the last 50 years, the single most important technological development is the computer. It's hard to imagine, in 1917, the instrument of the calculator of choice was a K&E 4081-3 log duplex decitrig slide rule, and in 1958 or so, when Langley was switched over to NASA, it was probably still the preferred tool of calculating choice. But boy, in the last 50 years, somebody had mentioned that, I think it was Dell, there's a remarkable transition of the computer, and I think we have to come to grips with all of the different ways that has shaped the work, and not simply as a tool to solve or to generate data and big data or to analyze that data, but everything from personnel to how you travel to how we communicate with each other. And this represents, I think, one of the single greatest historical challenges is that what most people in this room or at Langley in the last 50 years have made is software. And the question is, it's pretty easy to preserve an old wind tunnel model, and I encourage you to do that. Don't just tell your oral history stories, preserve some of your stuff as well. But how do we preserve software? The picture of the manometers that was shown earlier, frankly, you could still take those photographs, you could still read the numbers off of them, you could still crunch them, and you could get results. you could reproduce the scientific results of those experiments. But I bet everybody in this room has documents that they can't even open from 10 years ago or run, let alone serious scientific achievements. And I think that's one of our great challenges. But in mastering that, I think it sets up a really interesting agenda. So one story is, how does the computer change us? That's one way of thinking. Another is new disciplines. You heard about autonomy and robotics, and that's clearly a way you could think of the disciplines. I tried to hint about environmentalism and the concerns we have, national concerns. At its heart, Langley responds to national needs. That's why it's a national laboratory. It's a resource for the nation. And so those needs are generated out of the culture. So in some sense, we have to look at what are the big cultural concerns of our times. And there you will see the agenda. So that's another way you might deal those cards out on the table. The third is to look at people. There's a lot of stories that haven't been told. I got totally immersed in the structural research world of Langley and met a guy, Eugene Lundquist, who designed Building 1148. He told me this story. This is an oral history anecdote for you, Jim. He says, yeah, I made it too small. And I said, what do you mean? He says, yeah. He says, they wanted to build a lab twice as big. He said, but then I would have gotten stuck doing all the industry tests. He said, I wanted to do real research. I thought the future of Langley was to focus on basic research, so I made it too small for this. Fascinating story if you think about how we build our buildings, and then our buildings, we shape our buildings and our buildings shape us. So the architecture of Langley is another way of thinking about how our buildings have laid things out. So you can kind of see me playing with these topics. You could look at the national political agenda. People at NASA or the general culture obsess about Kennedy. John Logsdon tells us Nixon. And when I read that book, I thought, oh my God, he's right. Very, very crucial figure. So that's, you can see at the beginning, historians brainstorm and dissemble, and I've done that long enough, so I'll let the others take a stab at how they might think about that question.
Jennifer and Jim, we have 2 minutes for you to give some advice on how to interpret the last 25 years of Langley history.
Well, seriously, I would say that's why I'm saying we need to bring a young person in, because us old geezers, that's just boggles my mind to try to think about how to sort all that out. I mean, I think somebody that's young, that's fluent with some newer technologies and approaches. It's going to be a daunting task to try to put together what's happened, what are the threads, and how do we put them back together. The causality of it, why did it happen the way that it did? And one thing that I tried to teach my students as a historian, and I guess I'll just add this, if I hadn't had my years doing what I did here at Langley, I could never have been the teacher that I became. I was so much smarter and better as a teacher after I had this time at Langley. And that resulted, I taught large undergraduate classes. I probably had taught 25,000 students, 30,000 students over the course of my career. But I just think that in terms of telling the story, it's important for everyone to know that it didn't have to happen the way that it did. Sometimes it's helpful to ask the what-if question or think about alternative paths, because you can say, here's what Langley is today, and that'd be hard enough to figure out. But then to start, why did it become what it did become? And the simple-minded answer is, well, there were just things that led up, and it just had to be that way. Well, it didn't have to be that way. There were all kinds of contingencies that really shaped things. I'm a strong believer in chaos theory. A lot of things happen, and it's chaos. It's not logic. For me, logic of history is it's what Alice in Wonderland. It's not logic. So I think you have to have a historian prepared to think about alternative paths, and in the end, you are going to explain not the alternative paths, you're going to explain why it did happen the way that it did. But knowing that it didn't have to happen that way, I mean, I agree with Debbie in terms of the computer, but it sort of suggests a technological determinism, that it's the computers driving it and it had to be a certain way because of the computer. But I think within the realm of that, there's choices to make, right? There's choices that management's making, there's choices that the researchers are making, there's choices that Washington's making, and so on and so on and so on. And they could have been different. So the job of the historian is explain, is to figure all that out as best as possible, think about the alternative paths that weren't followed, and then you can make better sense of why it did happen.
Jennifer, last words?
Well, I would agree with Debbie. I mean, you've thrown out some great themes. Some of the other themes that I was thinking about is globalism. We're increasingly in a very global world. And, what impact has that had on Langley and NASA in particular? I think that there's a lot that we could look at in terms of Langley history. In terms of the Russians, for instance, who are now our partners, not our adversaries in space. So there's other things, but I know we're limited on time. So.
Our time is indeed up. People of Langley, thank you very much for making a fascinating history, and thank you for inviting us here to ponder it.